In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. The Abracast. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
All right, welcome. Today on the line we have Raymond Ibrahim. He's a fellow at the Middle East Forum. He is a widely published author, scholar, public speaker, and a specialist on Islam. His books include The Al-Qaeda Reader, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, and most recently published Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War between Islam and the West. You can find all of his information at RaymondIbrahim.com. Raymond, thank you so much for joining us and bridging this technological problem that we had earlier this evening.
Yeah, sure, John. No problem. Happy to be with you.
Yeah, I really do appreciate it. And before we get started, I want to congratulate you on your presentation to the Army War College. I know it was a difficult road for you with you had some hecklers there or something, right?
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. It's one of the largest politically active Islamist organizations in America. It was express purpose of existence is to basically shut down anyone who says anything that they don't like, namely anything that goes contrary to what they want to portray, which is that Islam is peace and so forth. And the Army War College had invited me to give a talk about the book you just mentioned, Sword and Scimitar, basically a military history of Islam in the West. And when they got wind of it, they protested. And long story short, this is a year ago that they were protesting. And the invitation was canceled. But then a lot of other people found out about it, including the National Association of Scholars, and several congressmen wrote letters to the White House and so forth. Long story short, the War College re-invited me to give that same talk, which I did recently, actually right towards the end of February, for the last few days of February, and it went very well. And the good thing about it is CARE ended up basically creating a lot of free publicity, because the building was packed with people who wanted to know what all the big controversy was and why these Islamist organizations wanted to suppress, a talk about history between Islam and the West. So yeah, that's good that it finally came to fruition.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and from what I understand is you blew a lot of people's minds with some of this stuff that's in your book and some of the other history sort of things that you were talking about, and some of that stuff I think we're going to talk about this evening as well.
Yeah, basically, and that's, I think, my thing is, if you really want to understand Islam, actually, if you want to understand anything, it's less about the doctrine, and I'm not trying to underplay the doctrine. I think it's very important that you know what the Quran says and that you understand Muhammad's biography and what he says. That is all very important, but I think that tends to be what people focus on, and there's ways to get around that for the apologists, whereas when you really focus at the history, basically, it's not what some abstract theological book says, but what Muslims have actually done, throughout history. It's a lot harder for the apologists or politically correct types to reject it, and that's why CARE did what they did when I gave the talk about the history of the book, because once that's out, as you will see as we talk, There's just no rebuttal. What do you say to it? And it's history, it's fact, it's recorded often in Islamic sources. So you just have to accept it.
Yeah. So how did you get started studying Islam? You have an interesting kind of backstory.
Yeah, well, based on my own, ethnic background and my family, my mom and dad or father are both Coptic Christians, which is basically the indigenous peoples of Egypt who are still Christian because Egypt was a Christian nation before Islam conquered it. So I grew up with, a personal interest in anything Middle Eastern. Obviously, I was born here, and I also grew up bilingually, so I could speak Arabic and I'm familiar with other Middle Eastern languages. And I studied it formally in college. I studied my majors were history, including master's degree, and some postgraduate work at Georgetown University and Catholic University. It was all in history about Islam. So I've, personally and professionally, I've had a long interest in this field.
So, in your research, this is just a general question because we talk about Islam quite often. And when we do, I always have to kind of stop and marvel at the Islamic apologists from academia and these historians. Do you find that, and is it vexing to you as well?
Well, I mean, I'm beyond the vexing thing. I'm also beyond the marveling, and I'm not saying one should not marvel or vex. I'm just saying I've moved beyond that. I was there at a point, so I know where you're coming from. But and I know why you marvel, because if you actually really become acquainted with something like the history of Islam or even the doctrines, and then you hear what these guys who are supposed experts are saying, they become antithetical at a certain point. They're just saying the exact opposite. And in the end, who are you going to believe? The Quran? Are you going to believe the Quran? Or are you going to believe Muhammad? Are you going to believe what Muslims today are actually saying? Or are you going to believe some Harvard professor? So I prefer the former.
Yeah, do you mark that up to political correctness? Because it seems like it goes farther back than this common or like our modern sort of fervor of this political correct business. What do you mark it up to?
I think it's a lot of things. It depends on who you're talking about. So a lot of people, it is political correctness. An even greater majority just don't even know the sorts of things that I'll be talking about. Sorts of things that seems so they don't even know it, and they basically just go along with the flow that that's what we all say, and then there's certain premises that we all know we don't go against. So you don't want to say something negative. You don't ever want to say that Islam is, for example, fundamentally or intrinsically worse than Christianity or any religion or any culture. So I think there's all these built-in mechanisms that we can call political correctness that do habituate people to talk this way. But having said that, there's also that core of knowledgeable people, from academics and historians and theologians, journalists, who do know better, but who actively dissemble. And that could be for any number of reasons. It could, again, just be to be politically correct and not jeopardize their career, or it could be because they get paid. A lot of these leading Georgetown University, which I actually went to, and which is when I went to it back in early 2000, it was considered, and probably still is, one of the premier universities for the learning of Islam in the Middle East. Okay, it has one of the top programs, but then you come to find out that they're actually being funded by a Saudi, a man, including with millions of dollars. So it makes you wonder, is their message compromised? And then you find out, well, it is compromised, because they're of all the universities, they tend to be the ones who are most apologetic, for Islam and that sort of.
Yeah. So I mentioned that we do talk about Islam a lot here, and when we do talk about it, we talk about this jihad business. I tend to start at 7-Eleven. when the Muslims took the Iberian Peninsula, which led to the Battle of Tours in 1732. But I recently have learned from you that it goes back a little bit further than that, right? I had never heard of the Battle of Yarmouk before. I was wondering if you can kind of enlighten me about it.
Sure. And you know what you just said there is very standard. You know, most people don't even know what you're talking about. They don't even know about Tours in 732. And those who are somewhat educated or educated, like yourself, when they think about the long historical war or assault or jihad on Europe, they begin it almost always with the Battle of Tours in 732. And the other battle that they always remember is the Siege of Vienna in 1683, which is almost 1,000 years later. Now, what they don't seem to recall, or they don't know, and the reason is because of history here has been taught in a nationalistic way, which is normal. That's the way it is elsewhere, and so you're familiar with Tours because it was Western Europe, and you're familiar with Vienna because it's also Europe. But the actual assault on, I want to say Europe, but it wasn't Europe. Before Tours, what you had was the Christian world. You had a much larger body, the post-Roman Christian world. So, the map was the same, but the civilization, you had one general civilization that encompassed what we know or what we call today as Europe. Not all of it, but, south and west of the Danube and Rhine rivers. The Roman region, including Britain, and all of North Africa, and all the Middle East. And that was all Christian soon after Constantine in the 4th century. And in other words, for 300 years at least before Muhammad came on the scene. And so you had different nationalities, of course, in different languages, though two of them predominated, Greek and Latin, Greek in the East and Latin in the West. But you had a holistic Christian overarching civilization where, people in Spain were going to Egypt and people from Syria were going to Rome and vice versa, crisscrossing, and that had been going on actually before Christianity. Plato, who, lived 400 years before Christ, actually referred to all the peoples living around the Mediterranean basin, both in North Africa, Middle East, and Europe, as common frogs around one pond. Okay, so that whole civilization was completely obliterated by Islam before Tours. So in the year 636, now we're talking almost 100 years before Tours. It's actually interesting. 100 years exactly before Tours is when Muhammad dies. Mm-hmm. So he dies in 632. And then the jihad on basically the Christian world that I just described begins. And obviously begins in the first area that's close to Arabia, which is where Islam comes out of, which is Syria. And there, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantine Empire, tried to contain this Arab uprising, as it seemed to them, that was this inundation coming out of Arabia. And they met them and they fought with them at Yarmouk. It's a river in Syria, in the year 636. 94 years before Tours. And at that battle, now that was a major battle, and it's in my book. It's in the first chapter. In fact, the Battle of Yarmouk was my thesis, my master's thesis that I wrote about 20 years ago, because it is, in many ways, probably the most important military encounter between Muslims and Christians/Europeans, and it's the one that, like you said, almost nobody's ever heard of. So after this pivotal battle in Syria, the Muslims win, and then it becomes like a domino effect. Then they flood into Egypt, and about 4 years after that, they conquer Egypt after a 4-year siege. And like I said, remember, Egypt now is a Christian, in fact, one of the very oldest Christian nations. And then after that, year after year, they keep edging westward. They go into Libya and Tunisia, Algeria, until they get to Morocco, at the very end of North Africa in the western portion. And then in 711, as you were saying, that's when they enter into Spain, and then they conquer Spain. And then by 732, now they're in the middle of France in an attempt to conquer it. So what's interesting about that is, again, you have to envision the map. But based on that massive jihad, the older, richer, and really more sophisticated portion of what we call Christendom, that is North Africa, actually permanently conquered. And everyone's forgotten that. And so, today we just say the Muslim world, Egypt, North Africa, Morocco, Syria, this is the Muslim world. And virtually no one remembers that that actually was the Christian world. And it was even more Christian than Rome and Constantinople and all these areas, but it was swallowed up piece by piece by Islam. And so, to summarize, we're all familiar with the term the West, which basically means Western civilization. But really, the origins of that term come from this long, nonstop jihad that swallowed up bit and bit, piece by piece, the old Christian world. Because what the West is, if you look at the map, is Europe. And Europe is just that last westernmost appendage of the Eurasian landmass, and of course in Africa, that was really the last bastion of Christianity ever to be conquered, or at least not permanently be conquered by Islam. Of course, Spain was conquered, and all the Mediterranean islands, and later with the Ottomans and the Mongols, Eastern Europe and the Balkans were also conquered. But that's really the origin of why we talk about the West. It wasn't the West before. It was actually that large Christian region which encompassed much more than modern day Europe. But it became known as the West because every Christian fled to that region because that was the last area left. And it too got conquered. Like I said, Spain, it had an Islamic presence for about 800 years.
Yeah.
And the Balkans, some areas for as many as 400 years. So yeah. Anyway, that's why the Battle of Yarmouk is so important. And various historians, I quote some of them in the book, actually, describe it as the most important and decisive battle in all world history, for the reason that I just said, because it completely changed the map of the world, and then it Arabized, all of North Africa and the Middle East. None of those people spoke Arabic, nor are they Arabs, until this day, but they were Arabized, and they took on that language and the religion, of course, most of them Islam. And so you can see how pivotal that battle was.
Yeah, so it's super interesting because it seems like when we talk about Islam now, it's like this is when mainstream whatever starts the clock. They start it with, okay, well, the Muslims have the Middle East, and that's where it starts, and no one ever goes backwards, which is why I found that information fascinating, and why I was also stunned that I'd never heard of this Yarmouk battle before.
Well, the perfect, just to interject, because I know we were going to talk about this, but this is a perfect segue to bring up something, So look at the Crusades. What you just said is exactly how the Crusades are always presented. If you talk to anyone, what are the Crusades? Well, they're all these evil, angry, fanatical Catholic Europeans with their, cynical Pope decided to enter the Middle East, or the Muslim world, where everything was hunky dory and Muslims were always friends with Europeans and vice versa, and then they just and they ruined it forever. And until this very day, Muslims are upset and have grievances. That's basically the general narrative, which is introduced in a vacuum, like you just said. But the truth is, what I just told you, plus it was a total of four centuries or more, actually, 4.5 centuries of this jihad that swallowed up the original portions of the Christian world, that went into Spain, that went into Tours. And then right before the Crusades, what had happened is now the Arabs were no longer the standard bearers of Islam, and they were replaced by the Turks, who had now become jihadists and Muslims and so forth. And they launched a major jihad into the Byzantine Empire right before the Crusades. And if you look at the sources, and I quote some of them, it was an apocalypse. Basically, hundreds of thousands of Christians all throughout Asia Minor, what we call Turkey today. Asia Minor, of course, was one of the oldest Christian regions. It's where the Apostle Paul sent so many of his letters that are in the New Testament. And so the Turks, right before the Crusade, were completely torturing, burning, killing, enslaving hundreds of thousands of Christians and burning their churches. Okay, and the Byzantine emperor, because of that, appealed to the Pope of Rome, Pope Urban II, for help. So that is the actual context. But we are never told that, right? We're never told that those Christians in Europe and Pope Urban, their primary motive was actually to help their co-religionists who were being slaughtered left and right, just as they had been for centuries before.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating the way that this is like it's all kind of tied together, and it also like repeats over and over again. And there's always like this shade of everyone ignoring the actions of this religious / political kind of culture. So I grew up in the 80s, right? And like being like a skateboard punk rocker, like this idea of like I'm more punk rock than you is always kind of like imbued in me, and that's what I think about when I think about these Islamists, because like you just said, like it went from the Saudis to the Turks, and there's always like this split between the sects or whatever, of like who's more punk rock than the next Muslims over, right?
Right, and you see it now. The Islamic State, ISIS, is, the latest fad, more punk rock than Boko Haram was, or than Al Qaeda was. Al Qaeda was really cool in 2001, but now they got replaced by ISIS, and now ISIS, I don't know what their status really is, but yeah, and that's definitely the case.
Yeah, so you mentioned briefly the Siege of Vienna, which it's kind of like the last kind of bit, and I know that there are some historians that say that this was actually like the nail in the coffin for the Ottomans, even though they limped on for a long time. I actually did a fictionalized version of Vienna, 1683 as a comic book, so I feel like the information that I put out there, as a piece of entertainment, people were writing back to me being like, where did you get this? Like, this never ever happened. And no one knows that this was like this epic event. And I know at least for a portion of history, it featured like the largest cavalry charge in history. I don't know if it stands, but yeah, it's like, these flying hussars, these guys with these fake wings on their armor, just like going bananas on these horses is like a great image,
Yeah, no, that's what you described is all true. And it was, as you say, yeah. I mean, actually, at the time, what you said is what historians say, which is historians normally say that after the Battle of Lepanto, around 1570, the Ottoman Empire began to wane. That's actually not true. In fact, the largest extent of territories that came under the Ottoman Empire was right before the Siege of Vienna in 1683. And when the Muslims marched onto Vienna, it was about 200,000 to 300,000 people, at least 200,000 fighters or jihadis, and 100,000 ancillary, people and concubines for entertainment and whatnot. When they came in, and after that battle, which was like you describe, it was, I know at the time in 1683, the largest cavalry charge. It's a very dramatic battle, actually. You and your audience might be interested in a movie out there. I think it's called The Siege. And it's precisely about it. It's like, it might be even on Netflix. It was a popular movie. It's made by some Italian production company, but it's in English, and it has a couple of famous actors, including F. Murray Abraham. Yeah. He's in it, and it's really a good movie. And it's, as someone who's closely studied this battle, it's actually pretty accurate, and it shows you that the large siege, the large cavalry charge, and the hussars with their wings, completely routing the Islamic army. But if you look at the sources, it was even the atrocities that were committed, are mind-boggling. Right before the Ottoman Turks were routed because they knew they were going to lose, they actually because I told you 200,000 to 300,000 people were there, so it was a humongous camp surrounding the walls of Vienna, and they had so many slaves Europeans, Christians that they had collected on their march there. So when they knew they were routed, instead of just leaving their slaves, they actually ritually slaughtered about 20,000 Christian Europeans and raped the women and committed all sorts of atrocities before fleeing. So yeah, it was definitely just another reflection of the perennial jihad. And right, then that movie would be good, but my point is it's not as graphic as the actual account.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump in time a little bit. There was this speech in 2016 where President Obama, I think he was in Baltimore or something, and he was out there talking about how Islam and the Muslims helped build the USA. And they were there from the start. Do you recall that? Are you?
Oh no, yeah, I do. I recall that.
Yeah. So I remember listening to it at the time and being like, "What is this guy talking about?" And so I was wondering what your thoughts were. Now that I think back about it, I'm like, is he talking about why Columbus was trying to find India? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, honestly, I don't know what he's talking about, but I do know when you talk to certain people who say what he says, here's what they say, and this is probably what he meant. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson, right, one of the founding fathers, had a Quran. In fact, I used to work at the Library of Congress in the Thomas Jefferson building, and I saw Jefferson's collection, including this original Quran from the 1700s. And the folks at the Library of Congress that I worked with, whenever dignitaries or people would come and visit, they would present this Quran owned by Jefferson as an example of how open-minded and progressive Thomas Jefferson was, because he was willing to take the time and learn about a foreign exotic religion. Okay, so that's the story. Now here's the truth. Now the truth is, yeah, he did get a Quran, but here's the background. So after America declared its independence and defeated Great Britain, or at least became independent from it, before it could even elect George Washington, it instantly got into its first war with who? Muslims. This is the Barbary Wars that begin right around 1800, or actually they begin right around 17. Right, like I said, right after the Revolutionary War is over, so like late 1780s. So basically, Muslim pirates from North Africa start abducting American sailors. They start attacking vessels, merchant vessels, and abducting and enslaving their crews. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, actually, who were both at the time ambassadors, one to England, one to France, met with the ambassador from North Africa of Barbary, and they said to him, "Why are you attacking our people, our Americans? They haven't done anything to you. We're not your enemy. Why are you enslaving us, et cetera, et cetera?" Now, the response of this ambassador is actually preserved in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Congress, and I duplicate it in the book. But basically, to paraphrase, Thomas Jefferson writes to Congress and says, "And he responded by saying that our prophet and our holy book say you're evil, you're sinners. It's our duty to enslave you. It's our duty to kill you. It's our duty to do this, that." And you can clearly tell the letter Thomas Jefferson's completely shocked by this, because this is the guy who, after all, said all men are created equal, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was the background of why Thomas Jefferson got that Quran, because he was trying to understand what this guy's talking about our prophet and our Muhammad and all this and that. So you can see right there, what people like Obama, how they play around with the facts, which is, yeah, Thomas Jefferson had a Quran, but it wasn't because he was pluralistic thinking or any of this sort of thing. It was because before we even had a first president, we were being attacked in a jihad, and he didn't know what was going on. But as to your point about Christopher Columbus as well, and this is another thing that few people know. Christopher Columbus, if you ask anyone what was his goal, what was his mission, you'll get anything from he wanted to prove the Earth is flat. He wanted to prove the Earth is round, to whatever you fill in the blank. But usually it's he wanted to get spices. Well, that's interesting. Why didn't he? I mean, do you really have to go around the earth to go to China? I mean, yeah, I mean, you're in Spain or Italy, right? Why can't you go eastward or through the Mediterranean? Well, as it happens, that area, as we know, was conquered by Muslims, and they were completely engaged in jihad, as I was saying, nonstop, including after the Crusades. Now, this is at the time. This, in fact, is the time when these pirates, Barbary. This is right before, what I told you about Jefferson. These pirates who enslaved the Americans in the late 70s were also responsible for enslaving millions of Europeans, Christians, before that. So mostly from the 1400s to the 1700s, and they went as far as Iceland and Denmark, Scandinavia in general, to get these millions of slaves that few people know about. So the reason Columbus was going westward was, one, he was actually trying to bypass the Muslim Mediterranean area because there's no way you're going to go east, you'll get killed. And two, he was actually looking to find, and this is a whole long, legend about someone named Prester John, legendary king. Yeah. Right. Okay. So Prester John, this legendary Christian Eastern king, they were trying to reach him so they can make an alliance with him and sort of crush Islam between them. And so you don't know that, but if you, I don't mean you, but people don't know that in general. But if you actually look at the letters, the correspondence between Columbus and Ferdinand and Isabella, that's what they're talking about. And so even the founding of the New World was a byproduct of the West's, being attacked by Islam and trying to somehow avoid or overcome it.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I did last year or 2 years ago, I did a series called The American Sermon where I was digging out all this kind of stuff. And when we got to Columbus, I brought that up, and a lot of people were just stunned. They were just stunned by it. They didn't know about Muslims taking all these slaves. Well, first of all, how would you? Because no one ever talks about that.
Right.
And also, like, the strict taxes on the trade routes. Like, they had these insane taxes on these trade routes for these spices, and all the Europeans were addicted to spices because, well, mayonnaise, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I get it.
Hey, I just want to remind you about the Easter sermon. It's available on my Patreon and my Subscribestar feed. It's free to everybody. You don't have to be a supporter of the show to get access to it. Just scroll down past a couple of the archive episodes and you'll find a post that's unlocked for everybody. It's called The Easter Sermon in Quarantine, the Psychological Crisis of Jesus Christ. And it was something a little bit different, and I think it was fun. I've gotten a lot of great feedback from it. So if you want a little bit more of the Abercast, it's a good place to go. Again, it's at the Abercast, on the Abercast Patreon or Subscribestar feeds.
Learn more at Abercast.com. Get bonus content by signing up for the mailing list. Get all that plus many exclusive episodes by supporting the show at Patreon.com or Subscribestar.com.
One other thing about this Koran, Jefferson's Koran, before we move on, is I just wanted to point out that this is the Koran that Keith Ellison was sworn into Congress with. And when that happened, everyone was just like, this enlightened Thomas Jefferson had this Koran, and he was just like understanding all the religions around the world. And you're like, I'm looking at this, I'm watching this, and I'm thinking he has that Koran because he's trying to understand why people are killing and enslaving his people.
Yeah, and that's a perfect snapshot of just kind of where we're at. where everything that in and of itself is actually indicative and reflective of Islamic aggression and hostility is taken by those who have, access to it, the guardians of the narrative, and not just suppressed, but actually twisted in a way to make it, show that Islam is progressive and tolerant and Europeans or Christians or whatever are not, as in the case, with the Crusades. I mean, if at the very least, people should just close their mouths and shut up and not even talk about the Crusades. But to take it and just completely remove the context, just completely delete 4.5 centuries of aggression and the Turks invading Asia Minor and slaughtering everyone and the Byzantine emperor crying for help, to just completely omit that and try to use it as a way to show, haha, see, here's these Europeans marching into the Muslim world, therefore they're evil. It's just reflective of how dishonest, these people are when it comes to the presentation of these issues and the facts.
Yeah. So after that, Islam kind of went into retreat after a while. I mean, they had like some stuff like in the 60s and 70s, some unrest and some like I guess now we would call it like proto-terrorism or something, like hijackings and all this kind of stuff. But I'm sorry, did you have something to?
Yeah. So after the Barbary Wars, Thomas Jefferson U.S. wars with North Africa, basically that was more or less the final spark of Islamic jihadi activity right around the early 1800s. And then following that, what you had is the colonial era. Okay, so now it's completely changed. Now Europe is extremely powerful, and now Islam is very weak, which it used to be the opposite. Okay, for about 1,000 years. So now European powers all enter into the Muslim world and start what we call colonizing. And now Islam becomes a spent force. If you actually, so we're in the 2000s. If you were to go to the Middle East in 1900, okay, or even like 1920s or 30s or 40s, you'd be surprised at how Islam was a non-issue. I mean, you know how you see women in hijabs or these coverings and men with their beards and all that now? That was very rare, actually, 100 years ago, which is kind of counterintuitive because normally we think, as time goes by, people become more liberal. It's the opposite. And that's because those peoples of the Islamic world in the Middle East were so influenced by the colonial era that they had essentially liberalized. They were not Muslim anymore, except in name. No woman wore the hijab. No, the men didn't have those beards. They were westward looking because they knew, well, that's where the power and the money and the prestige is. It's not Islam anymore. Islam got beat. Okay, now somewhere or other, and I would say right around the 50s or 60s and 70s, all 1960s and 70s, all that started changing. Not least because of kind of this Western retreat, this Apollo, this sort of self, hatred and apologizing for the West and going out of their way to praise Islam. All of that has actually had the effect of re-radicalizing the Islamic world. And that's, and that's when, from that point, 60s and 70s, that's where you fast forward and we get to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and all these groups. It's kind of it's a symbiotic relationship where the more the West is actually aggressive and asserts itself, the more Muslims are compliant and actually want to assimilate. And the more the West actually retreats and apologizes and hates on its own self, the more Muslims become aggressive and reclaim their jihadi heritage and essentially want to go on the offensive. It's kind of a weird psychological thing, really.
Yeah, so what you just said rings true to me because I think of like in the 70s, Iran, like chicks were wearing bikinis and businessmen were wearing suits and ties, and then Jimmy Carter happened, and all of a sudden they're like back in the Stone Ages almost,
Exactly. Yeah, that's what and now the problem is, see, most people they know modern history, so That's why when you talk about what's happening today, ISIS, Al Qaeda, all these groups, people know in the background that, well, you know what, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, there were no such groups. Actually, the Muslim world was kind of nice and we were friends. So obviously what's happening right now it's an aberration. It's not true Islam. What they don't understand is that era, that little small era from the late 1800s and 1900s, is actually the exception to the rule.
Yeah.
The real rule is what I've been talking about, which is that 1,000-year non-stop jihad bombarding every portion of Europe and the rest of the non-Muslim world. So that's really the mistake, the misperception.
Yeah, so I mentioned that, Islam went into some kind of retreat or, whatever until relevantly recent times. But when you look at world history, like the Ottoman Empire was involved in World War One, and we now know that there were in Africa, there were whole Panzer divisions that were controlled by, the Mufti of Iran and all of this kind of stuff. So it seems like they might have just been able to pivot around. I'm not exactly sure what to make of the World War One thing, but in the World War II thing, it's clearly everybody, both the entities were hating on the Jews. So that was an enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of situation. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so the issue with World War One and World War Two is it's to understand them you just have to understand they were, when it came to alliances and enemies, it was very political. So I'll give you an example. One of the gravest and most tragic days for all of Christendom, especially Eastern Christians, Orthodox Christians, was the conquest of Constantinople, which happened in 1453. Okay, so that's one of the most ancient Christian capitals, et cetera, and they got conquered. Now, right around sometime in the late 1800s, Russia, an Orthodox nation, actually was on the verge of liberating Constantinople and reconquering it from the Turks. Okay, so guess who came and helped the Turks? It was actually Britain and France. And they did that because of essentially real politics. Okay, they were afraid of Russia getting too strong. So they actually supported the Ottoman Turks, who actually had terrorized their ancestors before. But they did it because they wanted to sort of, buttress the growing power of Russia. Okay, so there you see how this is very reminiscent of what happens today, of course. And that's so that kind of thing starts spilling over into World War One, World War Two. World War One, the Ottomans are now the allies. Well, they're part of the Axis, right? The allies of Germany and so forth. But the Russians are against them. And the war that I was referring to, by the way, is the Crimean War. So that's when the Russians were on the verge. It would have been a great celebratory day that formerly all of Europe would have celebrated. But you can see that the French and the British went against it. So that kind of thing actually has been going on since the Crimean War in 1800 up until today. That's why you find, Western elements are somehow behind ISIS or behind so-called freedom fighters in Syria and Iraq, who we find out are essentially ISIS. Because there's definitely that political aspect to it. It's not all ideological, and it's definitely not consistent.
So one thing that I've never kind of understood about Islam and Russia is how we got Muslims in Sarajevo and in Bosnia. Is this kind of what you're talking about, the Crimea War and all this?
Yeah. Well, so the Ottoman Turks, like I said, they come from basically Central Asia originally, but then they poured into Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, which was all, one of the most ancient Christian regions. Bit by bit, it got Islamized. Like I was saying, right before the Crusades, Asia Minor was just, an apocalyptic scenario. But, over the centuries, it kept getting Islamized, and then the Muslims entered the Balkans, okay, the areas you're talking about. And they dominated those areas, they subjugated it, and, those people, most of them were Christian, and they paid tribute. But some areas that you mentioned actually did convert to Islam. And that's why till today, you have, the whole Bosnia and Serbia thing. One group had converted to Islam, due to these Ottoman incursions, even though they were both originally Christian. And now, so you still have a conflict till this day because of that.
Yeah, it's wild. So this kind of actually leads into my next thing that I want to bring up, which was jihad by immigration, or the hijra. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, historically, I mean, there's a difference between historically and what's happening today, and that has to do with today's stupidity. So historically, there was no jihad by immigration. There was just jihad by force, which meant, the jihadists would go as far as they can into infidel territory, in a non-Muslim territory, and fight and kill. And if they could consolidate that area, they would, and it would become a sort of, fortress, and then it would continue as the years go by to launch further incursions into infidel territory. Okay, now what you have is, Muslims who are emigrating to Europe and America and wherever that's not Islamic, and the justification, or let me backtrack. So if you're a Muslim, according to Islamic law or Sharia, you should not willingly ever go live in a non-Muslim nation. Okay, that is actually forbidden, because you want to obviously live in an area that is, that is supportive of and, furthers your own religion, Islam. But one of the reasons, or one of the allowances for you to go live in one of these nations, is if you're committed to jihad. Now, remember, jihad doesn't have to be violent. It doesn't have to be physical. Jihad just means you're somehow trying to work for or empower Islam somehow, okay, or spread it, or gain converts. So one of the ways that Muslims are justified to come live in America, Europe, or wherever is they actually have to be engaged in a form of jihad. And like I said, it doesn't have to be physical, and it could be propaganda, it could be whatever. And so that's sort of what's going on. A lot of Muslims who are traveling, if they're following the religion seriously. I mean, keep in mind, a lot of Muslims, are like a lot of Christians, where they're Christian in name only, or like whatever religion, Jews and Buddhists, whatever. Right. But they're not necessarily following it, So just like, instead of Joe Blow, your average Muhammad is not really a Mohammedan. Okay, yeah, just because his name is Muhammad doesn't make him into this just any more than the guy whose name is Christian. Okay, but like I said, from a legalistic standpoint, if you are an observant Muslim, emigrating to these Western nations is legitimized for you if you are somehow committed to helping spread or empower or defend Islam, all of which is called a jihad.
Yeah, so we've talked about like Germany, like the crazy sex crimes. We talked about, Minnesota, like the, Muslims running around beating people with hammers all the time, and and
I'm sorry. It's just, I don't know. I'm sorry. It's late, and I'm so used to hearing these sorts of things. But that's a new one. Hammers. Okay. I mean, yeah. I've heard it all. Axes and whatever. But
no. Okay. So like a year ago or something, like a bunch of I believe they were African immigrants that were Muslims. They were running through the subway systems in Minnesota, just smashing people with hammers, and everyone's like, we don't understand why these people are running through here smashing white rich people with hammers. And I'm like, I can explain it to you if you like. Like I got a hold of it. But there's also like micro versions of that, right? Which is you get enough people in a district and they can vote Muslims in, right? We see this.
Right. So here's the thing, for the longest, okay, so the word jihad, it's an Arabic word, originally translators, okay, who were translating it from, into European languages, or like English, they would translate it into holy war, okay? So if you were reading a book in 1800, you wouldn't even see the word jihad. It would just be holy war. Okay, now it's become popularized, the actual word itself, jihad. And a lot of the apologists have gone out of the way to tell us, hey, guess what? Jihad doesn't mean holy war. It means struggle. And they do this as a way to sort of defend Islam and say, hey, see, it's not all about violence. Now, what's interesting about that is when you do translate it the correct way as struggle, not holy war, that actually shows you how much more dangerous it is. Okay, so what I mean by that is jihad isn't just holy war. Jihad is doing and doing anything you can to empower Islam over non-Islam. Okay, so if you can do that by giving money, charity, as they call it, zakat, and send it to a terrorist, that's fine. If you, they actually have legal terms for this in Arabic, and I'll translate them to you. So they have the pen jihad, they have the tongue jihad, they have, like I said, the money jihad, they have the baby jihad, which means if you can go and procreate and have a lot of Muslim sons, especially, and indoctrinate them and make them jihadists, that's great. You're doing jihad. So, your point about election and all that, of course, all of that fits under this category of jihad. As long as you are struggling and striving and doing something that, in your mind at least, can help Islam, help Islam's image, help Islam spread, defend Islam from so-called Islamophobes, you are engaged in jihad, and that's what many of these so-called politicians and elected people like Ilhan Omar, that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah. So I know that I've kept you over. I know that we had a struggle getting connected in, but I was hoping that you could give me a few more minutes.
Sure.
Okay. So, I was looking at your profile on Amazon, and I found some tidbits that I want to kind of find out what the scoop is about. Can you talk about what you found and exposed about the demonstrations and the embassy attacks?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's years back.
Yeah.
So, all right. Remember when Obama was president, and there was an uprising in Egypt and also in Libya, in
the Arab Spring and all this.
The Arab Spring, and some American ambassador was killed in Libya, in Benghazi, and the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton, when that happened, it also happened in Egypt, instantly blamed it all on some YouTube no-name movie that apparently an Egyptian Christian had made, and supposedly that movie had angered Muslims, and that's why they were rising up and doing what they were doing. So that was actually, till this day, the official narrative from the White House, from Obama. But however, before this happened, before this Muslim uprising, because I've read Arabic media, was reading about how Muslims were planning on demonstrating in front of the consulate in Libya and in Egypt, all of which happened on 9/11, by the way, which is a reminder that this is intentional, as just a way to basic protest whatever they wanted to protest. It wasn't a movie, I know that for a fact. These were pre-planned protests and riots that were based on celebrating the date of 9/11, because I was reading about them before 9/11 came. Well, like I said, after they happened, the Obama administration spun it as an impromptu thing because there's some movie that just happened to pop up right around 9/11, and all these Muslims in Egypt and Libya and elsewhere got angry. So that was I reported that. I linked to the original Arabic article. I know a lot of large media ended up citing it to basically change the narrative, or at least challenge it.
Yeah, so it's interesting because my research and stuff that I've done when I was writing the Vienna 1683 stuff is that took place on 9/11 too. So there was like that 9/11 and then our 9/11 and then the Benghazi 9/11, and people, I talk to people and they're like, they don't see it. They're like, it's just a coincidence, bro.
Yeah, that's no, that's true. I mean, the 9/11 that happened with Benghazi and all that, and the 9/11, they're definitely connected. The one that you're referring to about the siege of Vienna, I'm skeptical to think that Osama bin Laden planned 9/11 in celebration of that, because first of all, the actual end of the battle was September 12th. That's when the major conflict took place. And I doubt an Arab like Osama bin Laden would be picking a date that has significance to Ottoman Turks and not Arabs. If it was a date like Yarmouk or an Arab conquest, then I would. But what you say is a lot of people say it. And I'm not even saying there is no truth to it, but I'm personally a little skeptical about it. But the modern 9/11 that I just told you in Egypt and Libya and the original 9/11 terrorist attacks were intentional.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It's cool. Okay, so I have one more thing, and I was hoping that you could talk about. You were the guy that uncovered and exposed this fatwa against any Christian church found in the Arabian Peninsula. Would you kind of tell us about that briefly?
Yeah, it's actually similar to the last account that I told you, and it's basically because I follow and read Arabic media. It was a big story in the Arabic press about how the Saudi Grand Mufti had either decreed or actually reiterated how if any church is found anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula, it must be instantly destroyed. And he gave all the Islamic references why this must be, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember I wrote a little, I think a blog about it. And instantly it really got picked up by a lot of websites, Fox News, and not all of them. In fact, most of them didn't, credit me, but they all reported it like it was crazy news and wow. And I just remember thinking to myself, this is a perfect example of how there's so many. They should have known. I mean, these places like Fox News and NBC and CNN, they have reporters all around the world. I mean, how can I be privy to something and their own reporters who are living there aren't? So it just shows you again how big major developments that because they're because they make Islam look bad, will just not get reported in the West. And most of those who did report it, like Fox News, that was their point. It wasn't so much that, oh, look what this guy's doing, he wants to destroy churches. It was the fact that nobody wanted to talk about it until some blogger at the time, me, wrote about it.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, you're out there doing the work and, you're out there doing presentations at the Army War College and stuff. So, hopefully you're publishing books, would you give your plugs and your links out before we wrap up?
Yeah, sure. If you want to know my magnum opus, my great work, everything I have to say about Islam is in my last book, which is titled Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. That's, by the way, of all my books, the one that, CARE and all these groups came out very harshly against and tried to suppress. So that one has the history I've been talking about. It also has the doctrine and, which Quranic verses are important and so forth. Anyone who reads and masters that also has like 1,000 footnotes if you want to know the original sources. It's not my words. I'm really quoting people, historical people. So I think that would be our one best bet. But also my website is RaymondIbrahim.com, and everything I write, I write several articles every day, every week, appears there. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, though I don't right now remember my handle or name. But if you were just to put my first and last name, I'm sure it'll pop up. But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, hey, thank you so much for spending your time and like this whole technical hoops we had to jump through to get here.
No problem.
I really had a good time, man. I think that we got a lot of good information out. And
likewise.
Yeah, I had a
happy to do it. Happy to do it, John.
Yeah. So so let me know if you ever want to come on, and hopefully I will find reasons to get you back on the hook and do this again.
All right. Sounds good to me.
All right, man. Thank you so much.
Sure. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Send an email or visit us on social media to to let us know what you think about this topic. And please remember to leave a 5-star rate and review.
Hey, did you learn something? Did you laugh? Supporting me is a way for you to be a part of the Abercast and ensure its growth and sustainability. It also means I can create a normal schedule for shows and bonus shows, as well as the exclusive Fellowcraft episodes. By supporting the show, you are not only a listener, but you are a part of the show. You supporting the show gives me a way to offer fun rewards as a thank you for showing your appreciation and support for our projects. Do you have an idea for a reward that you don't see? Let me know. My supporters are my partners. I currently pay for you to listen to the Abercast. Not only do I pay the hosting bills out of my own pocket, I volunteer my time and talent to each and every episode of the Abercast. The price of books, the time and resources of reading and researching, the massive amounts of gin and tonic needed, the equipment it takes to record the shows, the time and resources it takes to create the bonus material, and the cost to maintain the internet presence. Is it worth your support? I don't know. I'm proud of the Abercast, and I feel like I'm improving all the time. In addition to creating the show that you dig and that you are excited about, I also have a full-time commitment and other obligations. So why financial support? All of the supporters help me focus my time on the quality and development of the podcast. And what if you can't afford, $1 or $3 or $10 or whatever a month? Believe me, I get that. There are many degrees of support, but if you can't support the show financially, please consider leaving a 5-star rate and review on your preferred podcast app. And don't forget that you could sign into the mailing list and still unlock a lot of bonus content. Thank you. I cannot put into words how much it means to me that you listen to the show each time I post a new episode. Your feedback, support, and love of the stories that we talk about here is what keeps me going.